So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's public watershed meeting for the Jones Creek, Amite-Comite Creek Tribs watershed. My name is Jonathan Hill, and I'm a member of the team that's responsible for outreach and engagement. And we want to thank you for joining us for this informational meeting on tonight. And so tonight, the project team for the Stormwater Master Plan has gathered information as it relates to your specific watershed and is prepared to share that with you. And so tonight, we're going to spend a few moments going through a formal presentation. During that presentation, should you have questions or comments, you can click that Join the Podium button, which you see right there to the right of your screen that you are viewing me on. You can select that button, enter your comment or question into that dialog box that will pop up, and hit submit. And we have members of the team who are here ready to answer your question on tonight. But also another element we want to make you aware of is that if you have trouble viewing or you want to enlarge your screen to a full screen, there's a little toggle switch down at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, right next to the words that say YouTube. If you select that option, it will enlarge your screen so you can see the presentation even bigger. Now, should you have a question or comment, you need to go back and deselect that toggle button for you to enter your question or comment for tonight's meeting. And so that option will give you the option to enlarge so you can see all of the data that's being presented in a much more clear and bigger format. But should you have questions or comments, be sure to go back and select that same button again so you can minimize your screen. And then at this point, we're going to turn over to Melissa Kennedy, who is the project manager for the Stormwater Master Plan, who will take us from here to provide the informational update for tonight.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. First, I want to go ahead and introduce our team who we have with us tonight, who will either be presenting and or answering questions. We have Jeff Dowdrick, who is our lead technical engineer and modeler. We have Devin Foyle. He is a certified floodplain manager. He will be talking this evening. We have Madeline Osborne. She is one of the modelers and she will be presenting as well this evening. And we have Brendan Van Berken. He's another one of our modelers available to answer questions. And then we have Mark Goodson, who will talk about policy. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Stormwater Master Plan before I turn it over to Devin. Basically, the Stormwater Master Plan, what are we trying to do? We're trying to identify all the flood-related risks and areas of vulnerabilities. And what do we mean by that? Areas of that get flooded, how much do they flood, and then the resulting damages from those floodwaters. And then once we know that, we take that information and we try to develop solutions to reduce the risk of flooding. And these are through capital improvement projects that we'll talk about also later in the presentation. We also are looking at policy solutions to reduce local flood risk. And a lot of those policy solutions are going to be focused on development in the floodplain. And the one thing I want to talk about or stress is that we're trying to focus on the mitigation of damages throughout the entire parish. We know there are probably a number of individual homes that may receive flooding or have flooding related issues. Our focus is trying to capture as many of those damages and reduce the flood risk to as many people as possible. So we know there's other one-offs out there, and we're going to look at those, but our focus is overall flood risk for the parish. And now I'm going to turn it over to Devin Foyle, who's going to give an overview of the Jones Creek watershed. Devin.
Thank you, Melissa. So I'm Devin Foyle. I'm a planner with HNTB. Thank you for attending this meeting. And like Melissa said, I'm just going to briefly talk about the drainage system in this watershed. So right here is what you're seeing is just the entire parish divided into 11 different watersheds. So to better evaluate flood risk and evaluate it more efficiently, the project team divided the whole parish into these watersheds. And a watershed is it's an area of land that drains all of the rainfall to a single point or a common outlet. And so the watershed that we're looking at today is Jones Creek watershed, and you can see it popping out there in that blue color. And it's just crisscrossed with some of the major roads, just to like kind of orient yourself. So some of the major roads are Interstate 12, Florida Boulevard, Sherwood Forest Boulevard, Old Hammond Highway. And if you want to better orient yourself, or you want to explore the watersheds more deeply, you can go to our website and you can view an interactive map there where you can type in any address in the parish within the search bar, and it will tell you which watershed that address is in. So that's pretty handy. All right, so this is a map showing LiDAR. It's a LiDAR map. And what is LiDAR? It stands for light detection and ranging, which is a fancy high-tech way of saying it's a method for determining elevations. So it shows the elevations within the parish, but today we're focusing on Jones Creek watershed. So the higher elevations, they're represented by the darker red and brown colors, concentrated generally in the northern areas there. And the lower elevations are in blues and dark greens. And so those are concentrated around the channels and streams, especially close to the Amite River there. So water in this watershed is generally draining down to the southeast corner, down to the Amite River. And as you can see, we placed some images on this map to kind of help explain how the topography and different elevations of the terrain influence the drainage in this watershed. So the dotted lines represent ridges of high ground within the watershed. So there's one big one that you can see right there to the east, parallel to the Amite River. So the rainfall that lands to the east of that ridge flows to the Amite River. That's what that little squiggly zoom line is. And then rainfall that lands to the west of that ridge flows into Lively Bayou, and then down to Jones Creek, and then ultimately into the Amite River. And then there's another ridge in the northwest part of the watershed. Yeah, and this one makes kind of a semicircle, it forms a bowl of low ground in the middle. So the rain that falls down into that area, into that bowl, it has to squeeze through the low ground gap there to eventually, again, drain down in towards the Amite River. And again, it's worth pointing out the major roads that show up in this elevation map. Interstate 12 is a major one that cuts across the watershed. You can just kind of see that there. And these elevations are key to understanding just how water behaves in the watershed. So go to the next map. All right. So this map shows the FEMA special flood hazard areas. So FEMA 100-year floodplains. And so all of the areas shaded in blue are 100-year floodplains, 100-year designated FEMA flood zones. So what does 100-year mean? It means a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. It does not mean that a flood happens once every 100 years. That's not what it means. Just 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So, but what is this map really showing? It shows the areas that are most at risk of flooding that correlate to those low elevation areas that we're seeing. So if you remember back to that colorful LiDAR map, the lower elevations surrounded the channels, right? And so the flood zones shown on this map mostly surround the channels and streams. Something that's important to note in the Jones Creek watershed is that the 100-year flood source down in the kind of in the southeast area near the Amite, it's mainly driven by backwater flooding from the Amite River. And then I guess the 100-year flood source in the northern areas are mainly driven by rainfall. So that's just something to keep in mind. But what else do we see? So we remember those high terrains that we were talking about, that one that parallels the Amite River. You can kind of see that here, the one where the rain goes to the Amite on the east and then to the west, to Lively Bayou on the west. You can see that here. It's not in the flood zone. And then you can also see that bowl area, right, up in the northwest portion. You can see the flood zone up there, and then you can also see the floodplain kind of squeeze through that low ground gap there. And it's also worth pointing out in this whole map, the development that has occurred in the floodplain. So all of those lighter colored areas within, I guess, grayer areas within the blue shaded flood zones, That's just development in the floodplain, meaning that these areas are much higher flood risk. So yeah, go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this slide, very busy. It shows a map of the drainage system, right? So the blue line segments are channels and ditches, and that represents the surface drainage system. The white dots are structures that represent the subsurface or underground system, which is like, catch basins and manholes and inlets and the underground pipes. Each of the white dots are structures that lead to that system. So the project team did an extensive data collection effort for the entire parish in the very beginnings of this project. And the purpose of the data collection, it's so that you can't really fix what you don't know about, right? So you have to collect a lot of data to understand what we're working with. So the project team surveyed over 300 miles of channels and ditches parish-wide. Parish-wide collected data on over 800 bridges and culverts, and did massive data identification and evaluation of subsurface system, right? So that's over 67,000 of those subsurface structures, those white dots, were identified and put into a GIS database that the parish has. And all of this data is utilized to put into models to evaluate the system, right? And to identify flood risk and vulnerabilities, and Madeline's going to go into those models here in a minute. So our project team also asked residents of the parish to send us flooding pictures and stories, and that was a part of the data collection too. So the pictures that you see here, it's just a very, very small sample of what you sent us. All of the pictures that were submitted were helpful. So we log all those photo and email messages into our database and then map them using GIS. And they help the modeling team see on the ground conditions, which helps them better identify and evaluate flood risk in the models. So we read all the email messages and photos and found some common themes within the messages that you can see here. So residents feel that development in the watershed is a problem for flood risk. Many people noticed backwater flooding from the Amite River, which we saw apparent in the maps that we'd seen before. And a notable theme was that residents find maintenance of the drainage system to be a critical issue. These are just a few sample quotes that we pulled from the email submissions that we thought exemplified all of the submissions. So you can see that they really kind of express the same meaning as the themes: flooding from backwater, development exacerbating flood risk, and of course and maintenance issues. And that picture to the right is also one of the pictures that we just one of the pictures that we have gotten submitted from residents. So thank you. Okay, and so this map shows a combination of data that we receive from the public, right? So it includes all of those photos and email submissions that you gave us. That's the red star represents three things. So photos and email submissions that you sent us, 311 calls that have been submitted to the parish, and also repetitive and severe repetitive loss areas. And if you remember back to the maps that we looked at previously, you'll see that a lot of the stars correspond to the lower areas of the watershed, as well as to the 100-year floodplains. And if you look into the northwest area where that bowl is, you'll see a concentration there. And you can just see it basically in all of those areas that we kind of went over before. So that's just to tie it up. That's just an overview of the drainage within Jones Creek watershed. And I'm going to hand it back over to Melissa to take it from here.
Thanks, Devin. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of our modeling approach, and then I'm going to turn it over to Madeline, who's going to go into detail about this particular watershed. So we took a tiered modeling approach for each for the entire program. We have 3 levels of modeling. One is a tier 1 model. It's a regional model. It covers a very large area, and it's for more higher level flood mapping, and it's used for planning tool purposes. Then we have tier 2 model, which is for the watershed, and that's what you see in the picture here outlined in black. This happens to be clay cut watershed, but we've developed a separate model for each of the 11 watersheds. And this one gets us down into more of a neighborhood resolution that we can do flood mapping for, and we can use this tool for planning and design. And then we have what we call a tier 3 model, which covers a smaller area, and it's a tighter resolution. And again, we can use that for planning and design. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on that. So what you see here is a map of their regional model and the watershed level models. The green outline is the parish. The red outline is the extent of the regional model that we developed. So you can see it covers a very large area. And then you can see the separate little watersheds within Baton Rouge Parish. I did not have the tier 3 level model because there's too many to show on that scale of a map. So the tier 1 model, this goes back to show kind of the detail in each of the models and the grid size that is utilized to cover the topography and the land of each of these models. The tier 1 is a larger grid size, and we focus on capturing the major streams and major structures within that model. And again, that model is utilized really to analyze those longer duration storms that cover large areas, such as the 2016, the May 2021 event. Tier 2 model, again, we're getting a tighter grid, much smaller, a little bit more accurate for the neighborhood level. And we include all of the channels and many more of those structures. And then the tier 3 model is much more detailed, and that really includes the subsurface system. So that model, we're looking at the shorter duration, high intensity storms. And then I just want to go back on that tier 2 model. We look at the 24-hour storm and multiple rain events. So I'm going to turn it over to Madeline, who's going to talk about the specific modeling for this watershed.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm Madeline. I was tasked with developing the tier 2 model for the Jones Creek watershed. By developing this model, we were able to determine some important drainage features of the watershed, including the normal range of flow that can be seen in the channels, as well as flow when water reaches outside of the banks of the channels. We could determine how far flooding reaches out from the streams and the depth of the flooding, and how the flooding changes depending on the amount of rain that the watershed or surrounding watersheds receive. And from there, we layer flooding depth with property values. I think we're still on the last slide. Yeah, okay. We layer the flooding depth with property values at the areas where flooding occurs to get an estimation of the cost of damage related to flooding throughout the watershed, which allows us to focus on areas and prioritize areas where finding solutions for flooding will have large impacts in reducing the flooding risk. So the spots marked by yellow diamonds on this map show locations related to those big picture problems in line with open channel type projects. Playing on the screen right now is a simulation of 13 inches of rain in 24 hours, which is roughly equivalent to that 100-year flood that Devin was talking about earlier. And again, that's a 1% chance of happening in any given year. So for a reference, if you have a 30-year mortgage, you have a 26% chance of seeing this storm occur over the period of your mortgage. So as we move forward, we'll be talking about we'll be taking a closer look at the locations that are in those yellow boxes and discussing some potential ways to reduce the flood risk in those areas. Okay, so first up is the Sherwood Forest area. This neighborhood, we received a lot of emails and photos about the flooding that happened in May, which were extremely helpful in calibrating our models. This neighborhood is just north of the intersection of Lively Bayou, that's on the right side of the screen, and the upper branch of Jones Creek that runs along the left side of the screen. And you can see here there's a lot of flow converging at this location at the bottom of the screen. So the main issue to note here is the restricted floodplain throughout this area and the number of homes and developing that has happened up close to the channel. Generally, the closer a home is to the channel, the higher the risk of flooding is. And that's especially true in this portion of Jones Creek. So you can see in the top left corner of the screen, those homes that are close to the channel have a much higher risk of flooding in this event. You can also see that there's a significant amount of water ponding near the Sherwood Forest Golf Course that's in the bottom of the screen, bottom middle. And some good news here is that there's an approved Louisiana Watershed Initiative project for adding detention and storage in that golf course. So that will likely have a beneficial impact on the flooding here and play a role in reducing the levels of flooding that we're showing. Some other potential solutions in this specific area that we're looking into are adding more detention and floodplain storage wherever we can, which would be in some cases in nearby parks or open spaces, and widening and channelizing Jones Creek down to that LWI project area. Okay, up next is near Lively Bayou, which is just to the northeast of the last slide that we were looking at. This is another case of a very restricted floodplain. We've got lots of water coming into the stream and essentially nowhere for it to go except over the channel banks. So some potential solutions here would include straightening out those bends that you see in Lively Bayou, which is running through the north and the south. And straightening out those bends would help make it more efficient for water to flow downstream and potentially reduce some of the flooding. We're also looking at the possibility of diverting some of this flow that's coming through Lively Bayou into Honeycutt Bayou to the east and eventually out to the Amite. So kind of where the mouse is in the bottom of the screen, you can see that there's a channel that runs away from Lively Bayou. So since that channel exists, there's the possibility to widen it, improve it, and potentially provide some relief to the flooding in this area. And along with that, we're also, again, looking into adding detention and storage wherever we can. Lafitte Street Park might be a good location for storage in this area, but other open spaces might be an option as well. And one thing to note is whenever we analyze a solution like widening channels or channelization, we'll be making sure to look at the downstream impacts of those projects because we want to fix flooding in these areas, but we have to make sure that we're not going to be increasing flooding downstream. Okay. So here is a zoomed in view of Jones Creek as it runs under Interstate 12 and South Harrells Ferry Road. We're also looking just west of Forest Community Park. And as another reference, Millerville Road is running north to south on the right side of that screen. The main thing to note here is that there's just some major constricting going on near Jones Creek. We've got a lot of flow coming in from the combination of Lively Bayou and the north branch of Jones Creek, and it's constricted by I-12. It opens up again, is constricted again by South Harrells Ferry Road. So the first solution we'll be evaluating here is increasing the opening sizes of either of those bridge openings and potentially adding some inline detention and analyzing how that might be able to reduce flooding in this area. And any upstream detention related to the last two slides would also potentially have a beneficial impact on this area too. So now we are looking at a screenshot of a model simulation that was created using our Tier 3 modeling software, which allowed us to account for the enclosed drainage systems and look at things at a smaller neighborhood level scale. These models only account for rainfall at a small sub-basin level, so they don't factor in increased flows from rainfall upstream or potential backwater. The purpose of these models is to analyze the capacity of the enclosed systems at a local scale. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the Jones Creek watershed as a whole. We have it broken out into each of these subbasins that were modeled in the Tier 3 model, and the star is showing the location of the simulation that we're looking at on this slide. This area is the neighborhoods around Goodwood, Havenwood, and Molly Drive. The model shows a couple of areas of nuisance street flooding, which I have highlighted in those yellow boxes. In general, the capacity of these systems seems to be adequate for drainage at this scale. We're not modeling sediment in the pipes or maintenance issues that the parish is monitoring and addressing. So assuming that water is able to flow freely through these pipes, the model demonstrates that they are able to meet the capacity requirements for the storms that we're showing. The flooding problems at these locations are likely more closely related to increased flows in the open channels and potential backflow, which again, we're not modeling at this level. So as far as solutions go, here we're recognizing that regular maintenance and cleaning of these systems is very important in preventing flood risk, and we know that the parish is working to address them as they're brought to the parish's attention. And at a larger scale, this is one of those previous areas we discussed where we have the potential to channelize Jones or Lively Bayou and adding detention and even diverting flow away. Okay, our final location is the Country Ridge neighborhood where I-12 meets Millerville Road. The main stream running through this exhibit is called Knox Branch Creek, and you can see it going from the north to the south. That eventually outfalls into Jones Creek. This slide shows a similar story to the last slide. We've got some street flooding that are highlighted in the yellow boxes, and the systems here also appear to be adequate for these smaller level rainfall events. Most of the flooding in this location being caused by large events in backwater flow. So there's some potential projects here for big picture flooding that include the possibility of cutting a channel to provide an overland flow route for the water that's trapped in the northwest so that it can reach Knox Branch Creek and get to Jones Creek. And again, regular maintenance of these systems is key to keeping the flood risk down in these areas. And as I mentioned before, the models don't account for maintenance and clogging issues. So any information that can be gathered from the public related to maintenance is important in understanding the capacity of these enclosed drainage systems. Okay, now that we've gone through all of the exhibits, I'm going to do just a quick recap of everything we've covered. The watershed is subject to several types of flooding, including rainfall in different locations, backwater from the Amite, overflow from the Comite, and engineering depot canal. The main deciding factor of where water floods is the topography or the elevation levels throughout the watershed. The public has let us know that maintenance is critical to prevent flooding, and one thing we didn't cover was the details of the subsurface drainage systems, but we'll be evaluating different types of drainage systems like mixed systems versus your typical curb and gutter. And finally, we covered some specific locations and challenges throughout the watershed that proved to be critical in affecting the risk of flooding. Okay, so this is just a summary of potential solutions, and those stars are the potential project areas. Like I said before, this doesn't include every potential project, just projects we identified from an open channel level scale. And they're not approved solutions, but they're preliminary solutions that we still need to analyze to make sure that they're the best ways to reduce flood risk. So we've got floodplain preservation and detention, channelization and widening, enlarging some bridge and culvert openings, diverting flow, and improving capacity of the existing systems. It's still important to get public feedback for these locations and any others that might not be listed on this map, because it helps us to better analyze our models. And as a final note, this list of projects for the watershed will be updated, and we'll present it again at the next public meeting. So we'll be following up with our progress of analyzing these solutions for Jones Creek.
Thanks, Madeline. I'm going to just briefly go over where we are with projects that have been approved to date. Madeline touched on one of those. It's the Jones Creek detention. through the Watershed Initiative. But highlighted on this screen are the number of projects that are ongoing or have been approved. Maintenance of the existing system, the parish is currently working on that, is shown in the picture in the upper right. They've got money from American Rescue Plan dollars to address that, and they're getting more to do in 2022. We've got a number of hazard mitigation grant program projects that have been approved. One of those is on the picture on the upper left. That's a Ward Creek project, a constriction that's going to be removed. And then we have the Louisiana Watershed Initiative projects, which we talked about with the Jones Creek. And on the lower right here is a floodplain preservation project in Bayou de Planche. And we're also looking at low impact development policies that Mark Goodson's going to talk about in a minute. And then also the parish has been working on home buyouts of repetitive and severe repetitive loss projects. All of these totally to date have been federally funded. It's over 96 million, and there's still more that we're looking at. And again, as Madeline mentioned, maintenance is a big critical issue. And what you're seeing on this map is a summary of the structures that have been identified to have sediment issues in them based on our identification and evaluation of the system. Those with green coloring have 25 to 50% sediment level, yellow 50 to 75%, and red greater than 75%. And as I said, the parish is currently working on cleaning those out, and next year we'll be working on cleaning out channels as well. Here again is just a map of all the approved projects. This is also, I believe this is also on the website. On the right-hand side is a list of the hazard mitigation grant program projects that have been approved. This map also includes the core projects that are either ongoing or will be going shortly, including the Comite River diversion in the upper area of the parish. These green lines outline the channel work that the Corps is going to be doing. Channel clearing and snagging, and a little bit of widening. And then we also added the work that the parish intends to do beyond what the Corps is going to do. And then we're showing some of the Move BR projects that have an impact. So that's just a list of where we are right now. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mark Goodson, who's going to talk about our development codes. Mark? Did I see Mark on?
Hey, Melissa, I'm here. My
Okay.
apologies. I've lost video capability. Yes, so earlier this year, the Metro Council approved some interim policy changes, and I'm going to go through those quickly as well as give you an idea of what we'll be looking at over the coming months. The interim changes that were approved earlier this year included kind of three key elements. One is a stormwater conveyance check, which requires developers to measure the impact of the change that their proposed development will have on the flow of water. Another had to do with green infrastructure prioritization, and is really about requiring developers to prioritize green infrastructure in their transportation components of their proposed developments. So things like streets and parking lots, for example, they have to identify potential areas where they can incorporate green infrastructure and look at the feasibility of doing so. And then we also made a number of technical edits that were really aimed at cleaning up Chapter 15 of the Unified Development Code. That's the one that deals with floodplains, really to make sure that approved developments comply with the intent of those requirements. Next slide, please. Moving forward, we'll be looking at a number of potential policy changes. And now that the models are prepared, we have the ability to really study the impact that those policy changes may or may not have on reducing flood risk. And what we'll be looking at includes base flood elevation and potentially increasing base flood elevation in such a way that it could help possibly reduce flood risk and reduce flood insurance premiums for property owners. We'll also be looking at policy changes that can protect sensitive streams and their floodplains as a way to preserve important floodplain that's already providing a great function but also to improve water quality. Next slide, please. We looking at potential policy around fill requirements and what impacts those will have in terms of, how much we allow developments to potentially bring in fill to raise the elevation of proposed developments. And then now that we have the models, we can look at drainage requirements for new developments and the design requirements involved with that and what the appropriate requirements are for the conditions that we see now and the conditions that we expect to see, I should say, in the future.
Thanks, Mark. And last, I just want to quickly go over the schedule where we are. Again, we started this major endeavor in January of 2020, where we started our data collection effort, and that lasted for a little over a year. Then we did taking the data, incorporating it in our models and doing the modeling assessment, trying to figure out what floods, where it floods, what the damages are. And that is what we're wrapping up now. And then the flood risk mitigation measures, trying to find those projects and policies to help reduce the risk of flood. And that's the same as codes and ordinances or policies. And then our stormwater master plan report and capital improvement plan will be completed in 2022. And then the public outreach is an ongoing endeavor. And you see here, the red line is where we are at this point in time. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Melissa. And so there on your screen, you see the various ways that you can reach us should you have additional questions or comments, even after tonight's meeting. You can submit those questions or comments via email at info@stormwater.brla.gov. We check that frequently and respond to those questions or comments that we receive via that email address. But also we encourage you to follow us on social media. You see the various handles there at Stormwater EBR. We do check that for direct messages and any questions or comments you leave, even in the comment section. And as Melissa was stating, that we still look for feedback from the public, and you can submit it via one of those two methods. But we also encourage you to visit our website, stormwater.brla.gov. There's a wealth of information there. You can even view the presentations for the other watersheds we have done up to this date. And we encourage you to view our virtual open house. That will give you a wider context of what this effort seeks to accomplish. And so, as many of you have joined us tonight, we want to encourage you, you can submit your questions or comments via the Join the Podium option that's there right next to the screen you are viewing. If you are watching us in a full screen mode, you need to go down to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and select the little toggle that looks like a square or a four-way stop, and that will bring you back to a smaller screen where you can select this option for Join the Podium. And so as we begin our question and answer period tonight, we do want to thank Councilwoman Adams and State Representative Hodges for being on with us tonight. And so our first question for the team has to do around, does the city have any program in place regarding the dredging of Jones Creek for more water capacity and flow?
So I'll just start that off. The Corps of Engineers has their tributaries project. Jones Creek is one of them, in which they're going through and doing clearing and snagging. And they have some select locations of improved channel work. The parish then will continue doing that as part of a maintenance program. We have not looked at dredging in particular, and I don't know if Fred, if you're on, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll state that. Certainly, we had to submit to the Corps of Engineers, and that was for the $255 million program. Jones Creek was one of those projects. And quite frankly, the Corps felt like from the modeling that they looked at, that dredging wasn't necessary, that more of a clearing and snagging. And that's clearing and snagging component will be from the Amite River up to O'Neill. And then from O'Neill all the way up past Hells Ferry, past the Interstate 12, back around the curve going to Sherwood by the golf course. All that area will be, there'll be clearing and snagging, but there will also be some some bank improvements, and also it will be concrete riprap on both sides and the bottom of those channels. So that's what's being proposed from Jones Creek, and then everything north of that will be more clearing and snagging where it goes all the way up to Airline Highway. And the channel of Lively Bayou, where it ties into Jones Creek, just past Old Hammond, all that will also be cleared and snagged to all the way past Florida, where it goes up to the railroad track, Canadian National Railroad track.
Thank you all. Is there any priority given to protecting the undeveloped areas adjacent to the parish's creeks and waterways?
I'm going to say yes. As part of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, we identified 2 particular locations in which were approved to preserve those areas as natural floodplain. And we are, as we move forward, we are finding other areas that we're looking at to do the same thing. In addition, we're also evaluating coming up with a potential, what we're going to call a buffer zone from the edge of the channel banks out to limit or prevent development within those buffer zones to maintain more of that floodplain. So the answer is yes, we are looking at it.
Thank you, Melissa. Are future meteorological trends being incorporated into the projections?
Yes, and I'm going to let Jeff go into more detail regarding that.
Yeah, sure. So we are looking at how climate change is impacting the amount of rainfall that occurs within the parish. And we are incorporating that into our, as we get forward into project design, accounting for that potential additional rainfall that could occur within these watersheds. So for example, it based on the projections right now, a 100-year storm, which is about a 12.5 to 13-inch rainfall, would see about an extra inch of rainfall in the future. So we're taking a look at that, and as we develop the projects, we're trying to understand what the resiliency of each of the projects are. So for example, does that project provide the same benefit in 75 years as it does now? If there's an additional inch of rainfall, does it still provide a good flood control benefit? And if not, is there something that we can do to help, prepare for that additional rainfall that may occur?
Thank you, Jeff. Next question. Has there been any consideration given to larger scale green infrastructure systems like constructed wetlands for sites nearest to creeks and streams?
So we're also looking at, again, floodplain restoration or preservation, but in addition, we are trying to incorporate some green infrastructure into the projects that we are developing. So for example, the detention in Jones Creek, there may be a small section of that would be left as a wetland component. So we are doing that, and we're going to be recommending more of just a green infrastructure mentality moving forward. I don't know if that answers the question. Jeff, did you want to add anything to that?
Not really. Just where we can find, if it's already a natural area, we don't want to bulldoze all the trees down and put in a new wetland. It's already a good riparian corridor. Let's keep it where it's at. If it's been previously developed, or if it's an old golf course, for example, those are areas that we might be able to do what you're talking about there in terms of restoring that to maybe more of a natural floodplain, kind of a wetland area.
Thank you. Mark, were you about to chime in? I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to add that going back to those interim changes that were approved earlier this year, they do require that developers prioritize and make an effort to prioritize green infrastructure as part of the transportation components of their proposed projects. But as we look at, more and new and different design requirements that are appropriate, additional green infrastructure, policy recommendations may come forward in terms of how to incorporate them into new development in other ways beyond just the transportation pieces.
Thank you all. And so for those who are watching, we want to encourage you to submit your questions or comments. You can Select that join the podium button and submit your question, and the project team is here ready to answer those questions on tonight. There's a request to re-show the slide with the potential solutions, the projects that were identified, to discuss those and any idea on the time frame they would be implemented.
So right now we're trying to develop solutions for different problems, flooding problems, and each of those solutions there's going to have to be money associated with it. So we identify the cost, and then we're going to be looking at funding sources. And I don't know if you already know, but when there's federal money out there, as there is with the Watershed Initiative and with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, it's not a quick process. It's slow, and it takes a number of years to go through. So, but we want to be able to capitalize on as many federal dollars as we can. So as we go forward and more federal dollars are made available, we will submit those types of projects for additional federal funding. So it's hard to say the actual schedule. We're developing a 20-year capital improvement program. So what that means is all the lists of projects that we come up with will be prioritized, have funding associated with it, and a schedule over that 20-year time frame. And we hope to have that capital improvement plan completed second quarter or third quarter, early third quarter of 2022.
Thank you, Melissa. Is there any consideration being given to a stormwater fee?
I think that was just brought up yesterday at council. Fred, did you want to touch on that one?
I will just say that, yes, it's going to be for consideration. Certainly, there will be a lot of discussion about that. It was presented to the council last night for consideration. Certainly, we're going to need to do a study on the fee component itself. We'll probably be looking at Black and Beach to do that type of study, to look at what we have, look at the components of residential, commercial, and that will be something that everybody will have to pay in regards to that, or consider for the fee if it's approved by council. It's a component that needs to be looked at. Certainly the final decision that will be, if it's going to happen or not, will be made by the council. But our goal and objective is to provide the best data that we can. And I think that's what we started doing that. And I believe to show the public why that need may be, because I think it's something that we need to look at in the future. Other cities have, doesn't mean that we will, and I understand that, but I think we have to do our due diligence, because where we are right now from a maintenance, and particularly dealing with manpower, it's almost impossible for us to meet the requirements that the public is asking for us. And the backlog is so significant that, and the lack of people that we have, and not be able to hire people because people are not interested in coming to work for the city, or like most business, they're not interested in going to work. But we're paying a price for that. And unfortunately, that's just something that we want to look at. And certainly the public will have plenty of opportunity. There'll be plenty of meetings to discuss the fee proposal if it becomes reality.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, as Fred said, there currently is this backlog of maintenance, and to catch up with that backlog and then keep moving forward to prevent that, there is a cost associated with that. And then also any project that is constructed has a maintenance component to it as well. So that will also be added. For example, the Comite River Diversion Project, the parish is going to be responsible for the maintenance of that project once it's constructed. So any type of these projects that are added adds additional maintenance costs that needs to be incorporated into the program.
Melissa, any project that we have dealing with federal funds, it's a requirement set forth by the federal government that we are required to keep it up, and they set the standards of the type of maintenance they would expect. And if we don't meet those requirements, then the federal government will come back and tell us you will pay for the entire project or reimburse for the total cost. So that goes for the Comite diversion, which is around 400 million. And then they also could come back and deal with us with the tributaries project, which we are. There'll be a maintenance component in that, in the agreement, that's going to require us to keep it maintained to a certain level. If we don't meet those requirements, it could be a penalty regards to that too.
Thank you both. So there's a question regarding new developments with higher foundation elevations and being next to or in existing older nearby neighborhoods or development, wanting to know what impact that would have.
So we're actually evaluating that right now as part of our policies evaluation, because we do want to look at that and make sure going forward that whatever codes and ordinances are out there are evaluated and updated if needed to make sure that that doesn't happen, that if a new neighborhood does go in, it's not only addressing making sure itself doesn't flood, but it doesn't have a negative impact on its neighbor. And as Mark talked about earlier, that conveyance check is one of those components that will definitely help do that. But there are other things, again, that we're looking at as well. So as you saw in some of the model demonstrations, again, as the water, leaves its channel banks, it just sheet flows. And so, there's areas, if you put a barrier in that area, that water still has to go somewhere. So we're definitely looking at that. And we definitely will address that.
Thank you, Melissa. And so once again, if you have questions, you can submit that, click that join the podium button and submit your question or comment. We have one more that's pending now, and then we'll prepare to wrap up if we receive no additional questions or comments. There's a question to explain the 100-year flood.
So I'll give it a shot, and otherwise I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. It's basically the 100-year flood as defined by FEMA. Is a chance any given year you have a 1% chance of that flood happening. It's the rainfall associated with that event happening. And again, as Madeline and Devin said, it's not that that's going to occur once every 100 years. It's just that you have a 1% chance every year that could happen. Now, I know a lot of people are looking around going, well, we seem to have had that more frequently. And in some areas that is probably true. In other areas, they have not seen it. So I don't know, Jeff, did you want to add anything that might be more clear?
I think what I'll say there is, a 100-year flood doesn't necessarily mean there's 100-year rainfall. You could get because rainfall isn't spread evenly across an entire watershed, for example, you might have concentrated areas of higher rainfall in other areas that don't get as much, which may even out to a 100-year flood downstream, for example. Such as like in the August 2016 event, there were areas in the northern areas of the parish and farther northward that got in excess of 500 to 1,000-year event. Areas within Bayou Manchac, for example, had about a 10 to 25-year event. So it really just depends. But yeah, it's about 100-year is just another way of saying a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And that number changes over time with climate change as well. So that's one of the things that I kind of talked about earlier that we're looking at, that 100-year chance of occurrence. It does end up being a higher rainfall depth, but you can also look at that as that it occurs more frequently as well. So.
Thank you, Melissa and Jeff. And it appears our final question that we received for tonight. How much funding that's non-federal funding has been allocated to the stormwater plan from the EBR Parish 2021 budget?
I'll answer that, Melissa. When we first started the program for the stormwater master plan, Mayor Broom wanted to see what we needed to do to address our future flooding. I do know that I believe about $1.6 million that for phase 1 and phase 2 was funded by local tax dollars that we were able to take out of our Department of Transportation Drainage budget and some out of the general fund budget. So, but the rest of it that's been set aside for this program, which is close to $16 million of the remaining came from federal funds. And the good part about that, which most people don't realize, is that it's funded 100%. And originally when it was proposed, it was a 75-25. So we would have had to come up with additional funds. We thank the congressional delegation for pushing on that to at least get it to 100% of federal dollars. And we were able to continue to move forward with the program as we're doing today.
Thank you, Fred. I guess we got one more. At what point will stormwater controls limit future development?
I'm not sure if I can know how to answer that one, but I'll give it a shot. So again, we're going to be looking at the policies and making recommendations for changes. And those recommendations will have to go through a stakeholder policy group for evaluation, and then eventually they need to go to Metro Council for approval. So we're hoping whatever we finally recommend will make it through approval and adoption. I can't guarantee that, but that is the intent, is to make those recommendations to address development in floodplains. As well as, and I shouldn't say just development in floodplains, it's development everywhere, because all development has a drainage component. And we want to make sure, regardless of where it is, that development drainage design doesn't have a negative impact on adjacent properties. Does that answer? I don't know if Fred wanted to add anything to that one.
It doesn't appear. All right. So can you go to that contact us slide, Melissa, with the information? Yes. And so thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this informational update as it relates to the Jones Creek watershed. This presentation will be available on our website. You see it there at www.stormwater.brla.gov. So if you know anyone who missed it, or you came into the presentation late and you want to rewatch it, please feel free. You can watch it at your leisure. And should you have additional questions or comments while you're watching that presentation or afterwards, we encourage you to submit them via the email address there, or you can select the button Contact Us on the website, and the project team will respond to those questions. Melissa, any final comments?
I don't know that I have anything. I guess I would just say I encourage people to make sure they have flood insurance. Well, this is Southeast Louisiana, as you saw, so much of our area is already in flood zone. And just because you're not in a flood zone doesn't mean you can't get flooded, as many people in 2016 discovered. So, you know, when you get a mortgage on your house, the bank is making you get flood insurance because they understand the risk. So I just want everyone to make sure they get flood insurance.
All right. On that note, have a great night. We will see you all in the virtual space again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.